Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all having a very nice day wherever you are in the world. I'd like to continue my discussion of my favorite releases from the Criterion collection from this year, 2019. This time, I'd like to talk to you about the supplements. As you know, the Criterion collection releases films on DVD and Blu-ray, oftentimes with a variety of supplements for each title that are designed to help the viewer further appreciate and understand the context in which the films were made, the historical background, the production background, any kinds of anecdotes or other kinds of information that may prove to be helpful. These anecdotes are often provided by people directly involved with the production itself, such as key crew members, members of the cast, etc. There are also oftentimes interviews provided by scholars and film critics who are experts in the particular films, etc. Not to mention, of course, that there are oftentimes audio commentary tracks. There are oftentimes other archival footage segments, pictures, photos, sometimes television programs from a variety of different networks from North America and outside, dealing with, let's say, interviews given at the time, behind-the-scenes footage that might have been contemporarily made, and that sort of thing. So all of the supplemental materials come from potentially a wide variety of sources. Sometimes the supplemental materials are produced by the Criterion collection. In other words, they are made specifically for the Criterion collection release and are oftentimes conducted by or otherwise produced by key members of the Criterion collection for purposes of, as I say, trying to provide further background or other insight and information with respect to any particular film. Not all the supplements, of course, are provided by or produced by the Criterion collection. Oftentimes we might find, for instance, commentary tracks that were taken from non-Criterion collection releases that were prior to the current Criterion collection release. The same is true, for instance, maybe of archival television programs, maybe other kinds of interviews that might have been found on other non-Criterion collection releases but then were brought into the Criterion collection supplemental catalog for whatever reason. So, in other words, I want to just keep in mind the fact that not all the supplemental features are all Criterion produced, but some of them are. So what I'd like to do is today I'd like to focus on the supplements from the Criterion collection releases from this year that were Criterion produced. So that will limit the overall list of the supplements that I'd potentially be able to talk about. But even with that limitation, my friends, I do want to suggest to you that still the list is quite large because the number of Criterion produced supplements, I think, is still very significant and plentiful. There are so many supplements to choose from, and the wide variety of the supplements means that I think if anyone were to make a favorites list, I think one's list will vary from person to person to person. In other words, I don't know if it would be possible that any two people might be able to, in isolation, create a list that is identical to each other. In other words, I think your list will undoubtedly differ from my own list. And also I acknowledge that this is something that I would constantly change. It's something that is in flux, and so even now I would suggest that the list that I'm about to present might not be the same list I would necessarily have this time of the day tomorrow, for instance. And so that's just, I think, an indication of how various and how exciting the overall selection of supplements from the Criterion collection was this year. It was a very great bunch of insightful material. But these are just 5 of my favorite supplements from this year. So once again, this is my own list, so please don't worry if it doesn't necessarily match up with your own. Again, this is my own list, and I do acknowledge that this could change at any given point in time. It just so happens that I am making this video at this point in time. So at this point in time, my friends, here are my 5 favorite supplements from Criterion releases from this year, 2019. Number 5, and this is spy number 982. The film is Hedwig and the Angry Inch, and the supplement in question is a Criterion-produced supplement that is a filmed conversation between 2 individuals. On the one hand, we have rock and music critic David Frick, and on the other we have the film composer and lyricist Stephen Trask. So Stephen Trask and David Frick are sitting in a room talking about this particular film, Hedwig and the Angry Inch. And in particular, they are speaking to the music and the musical choices and the song choices and the particular aspects of musical style and the like going into this remarkable and extraordinary cinematic adventure that is Hedwig and the Angry Inch. I find that this selection of supplements is quite strong. There are other supplements that I think I could have chosen, but for purposes of this particular film and the fact that music and a particular style of music and musical expression in terms of song and song lyrics and how that is a kind of representation used in the film as a means of self-expression, which is a very key component of this film. I think that the discussion of the musical themes and musical concepts and also the general philosophy behind some of the choices that were made, I think is actually, for me, a very vital and integral component in order for me to better appreciate this film. And I find that the discussion between the 2 gentlemen here is very friendly, very down-to-earth. It's not so, how shall I put it, it's not a stuffy discussion, but it is quite a jovial and casual one, yet it is one that is filled with many insights and also interesting comments. I say, for me in particular, I think it's very interesting and insightful, as I personally don't have any strong musical background or any background in musical history or music studies. So for someone like me, this kind of supplement needs to be of a certain, maybe fundamentally basic level for me to be able to engage with it. But I found this level of engagement both, I think, very easy to get into for someone like myself who is maybe not necessarily music scholar, and yet at the same time it gave me a lot of stuff to consider. And as I say, I think that stuff to consider is very important when you're considering the role in which music plays in this film. It is absolutely essential, and it creates a mode of almost freedom and self-expression that is a strong component in why I think this overall film is a remarkable and almost a breath of fresh air type of lively and energetic experience. So the film is Hedwig and the Angry Inch, and the supplement in question is the discussion, the filmed conversation that was had between David Fricke and Stephen Trask. Number 4, and this is Spine 994. The film is this film, Local Hero, and the supplement in question is yet another filmed discussion conversation. This time, in the context of this film, we have the Criterion produced conversation that was had between two individuals. On the one hand, we have the filmmaker Bill Forsyth, and on the other we have film critic David Cairns. So David Cairns and Bill Forsyth are talking in a room, and it is being filmed, and this is a Criterion produced supplement found on the release of Local Hero. Now, why do I find this particular discussion interesting and worthy enough to have it mentioned here in this video? I think it's very simple. I really find that this film is in many ways a kind of a unique film experience, not just in terms of story, although there are many unique turns in the story that make this unforgettable. This work is quite unforgettable and quite impactful. But there are many stylistic choices, cinematic choices that I find quite fascinating. And I would dare say that many of those choices, or fundamentally speaking, the primary source of those choices would seem to be the filmmaker Bill Forsyth himself. So where we have an interview type of conversation with David Cairns, who I think has a perfect level of respect for the filmmaker, as well as a good deal of reverence, but also a nice down-to-earth tone to the conversation that doesn't ever give it an air of unnecessary loftiness or something akin to that. On the contrary, this is a conversation that is very easy to get into, it's a great pleasure to listen to, but it also provides a wonderful insight and look not only into the specific choices that were made with respect to casting, with regard to the way the story was put together and the narrative choices, etc. But also it provides, I think by extension, a wonderful insight into the mind and the thinking of the filmmaker and artist Bill Forsyth. There is a kind of there's a kind of humbleness on the one hand, and yet there is also a wonderful and quite lovely sense of individualism that comes to the fore when we hear Mr. Forsyth speak about his choices and how they might be seen as not necessarily being maybe conventional wisdom type of choices on the one hand, and yet they remain wholly individual to his style and to the style of the film, and thus they are so right for purposes of this film in the context in which this work, Local Hero, gives the viewer much food for thought. Therefore, I find that this supplement does a number of things really, really well, which is why I've named it here. It provides insight into the filmmaking mind of Bill Forsyth, as well as providing specific insights into certain choices that were made regarding this, as I say, very impactful film, Local Hero. Therefore, for purposes of this discussion, my number 4 choice for my favorite supplement is the discussion between David Cairns and Bill Forsyth, which is found on the Criterion release of Local Hero. Next is my number 3 choice. This is spy number 962. And the film is Death in Venice. And the supplement in question is called Showing the Story, Luchino Visconti and Death in Venice, which is a kind of interview or discussion with Stefano Albertini. So this is an interesting discussion from Mr. Albertini, who is a literature and cinema scholar. And this is great because it is talking about the way in which Visconti approaches not only the craft of filmmaking, but also the emphasis that Visconti places upon the subject matter upon which the film is based, which is the Thomas Mann novella, Death in Venice. And this provides thus a kind of insight into how Visconti, the filmmaker and artist, took this material and translated it into the vision that became the film Death in Venice. If you know the works, the literary work and the film work, you might know that while there are many similarities, there are also some considerable differences that are made, quite fundamental differences also that are made with regard to how the work was eventually adopted and adapted into the Visconti film. Incidentally, if you have not seen this Visconti film, Death in Venice, I think you are in for quite an unforgettable ride. It is it feels like it is a film of a certain bygone era. It is a film that is very slow in its pace, but it is very methodical. It is very purposeful, and it is meant to show us in filmic terms, in cinematic terms, something akin to a kind of almost a kind of maybe something that is unattainable in the human heart, or as expressed through human emotion. You know, these sorts of feelings that we sometimes have and sometimes feel that are difficult to describe in words or difficult to express in a vision. They are just things that we feel, right? But I think the film is an attempt or an endeavor to try to, in some kind of visual and music terms, capture these otherwise ethereal feelings, these ungraspable feelings that we might otherwise feel during our human existences, whatever they may be. That's how I feel about this film. In other words, it is a way in which we can see, captured in cinematic terms, emotions and feelings that might otherwise be considered indescribable, or so emotional so as to be indescribable. And I find, therefore, the film to be quite a remarkable achievement. The film supplement that was provided by Mr. Albertini, as I say, goes into Visconti, the filmmaker, and his approach to literature. And as I say, I think there are many choices that were made that I think show a purpose and a vision that Visconti had, and trying to translate this work by making certain stylistic changes or certain ways of viewing the world that are definitely reflective not only of Visconti as a filmmaker, but also Visconti as a man, and also as a person growing up with the background and the family that he came from, and his background, his personal background. So, in other words, this film, I think, is so important. Or let me put it another way. I think to understand Visconti is, for me, a vital component in my being able to further try to understand this beautiful and at the same time quite mysterious work of art. And I think many things can be said, and I think there are certain there are certain implications that I think are reasonably made in the supplement that might be trying to tie the filmmaker with the subject matter of the film itself in kind of in very direct terms, which I think is very appropriate. So therefore, this supplement as a kind of, if anything, a further elaboration on Visconti and his cinematic sensibilities, as well as his take on this work of literature, is incredibly important for me in order to be able to try to further gain a better appreciation for this work, which I find quite breathtaking and beautiful. So this is the discussion with Stefano Albertini called Showing the Story, Luchino Visconti and Death in Venice, which is featured on the Criterion release of Death in Venice. Number 2. This is spy number 967. The film in question is I Wanna Hold Your Hand, and the supplement is an interview with two of the actors who are featured in the film. And the two actors are Nancy Allen and Mark McClure. So Nancy Allen and Mark McClure are sitting together, and they are both they are talking with each other, and they are also being interviewed by someone off camera. And this is another Criterion-produced interview of these two wonderful and charming individuals talking about their experiences with this film, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. This is a film that I think is one that I find so endearing and so charming. I think not least which because I am a big fan of the Beatles. I really love the Beatles and the Beatles music, and I think part of that really not part of that, I should say, that aspect of my my love of the Beatles makes me really love this film, because as you may know, this is a film which is about a group of teenagers who are caught up in maybe the height or maybe the introduction of Beatlemania to the United States during that time when the Beatles first came to America and they were about to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. So this is a very big deal in sort of pop music history during the 1960s. And of course the Beatles were the biggest thing around. So to have them come to America and see all the hype and the hysteria and all the frenzy that was whipped up by all the fans there, it's quite amazing to behold when you see the documentaries about that. But here we have a story that was crafted around that particular event in history, and we have different characters that are thrust into this, and they each have their own little story that is followed, and there are connections, and then they are broken off and they come back together again. And this therefore becomes a sort of milieu tableau film with a bunch of characters that I think each has his or her own character traits and quirks that become very significant as the film progresses, and there are narratives, threads that are created, and they drift off and then come back together again in a very clever way. And all this set against the backdrop of, as I say, the story of the Beatles coming to New York and getting ready to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time. So this is I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Now, the supplement that I wanted to mention was the interview between Nancy Allen and Mark McClure. This interview with these two actors is really great because they, of course, they go into a little bit of their background, how they became actors. They also go into this film and how it fit into the context of their respective careers, professional careers. So that is also very interesting. You know, Nancy Allen and Mark McClure, they're two they're really great actors, and they've appeared in some sort of monument films of the 1970s and 1980s, and so to have them together in this interview is really quite splendid. They also go into certain insights into the film and certain anecdotes about this work. Now, one of the things I was so amazed by was, I think, a particular anecdote that Nancy Allen provided with respect to the script and the reasons behind the names that were given to the four main characters, the four main female characters of this film. And Nancy Allen gives a little bit of insight into the reason why those four characters were named the way they were named, and how that relates to the Beatles themselves. And so I never knew that, actually. I admit that I'm not the biggest expert in I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I wasn't necessarily a big expert in the film prior to getting this release, so I didn't know all the details of the trivia with respect to this film. So it might be kind of maybe something that's not new for those of you who are really familiar with this film, but for me, I found it incredibly insightful, and I was so happily surprised by the bit of information that Nancy Allen gave as to her understanding about why the four characters were named the way they were named and how that relates to the Beatles themselves. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, I suggest you try to catch up with the supplement and check out what Nancy Allen has to say. I think it's really great. That is an example, my friends, of why I really, really love this particular supplement, and so I have no problem at all. I'm so happy to put this particular supplement, the interview with Nancy Allen and Mark McClure, that is found on this release. I'm so happy to put this at number 2. And we have my number 1 favorite supplement from 2019. This is from spine number 959. The film in question is In the Heat of the Night. The supplement in question is a Criterion-produced interview given by the actor Lee Grant. Now, Lee Grant is an actor who appears in this film. She appears in a sort of supporting role. So it's not the most prominent role in the film, but it's a supporting role, and her performance is really quite moving. It is very moving, and it has a lovely resonance with the overarching theme of the film, in terms of racial tensions and the context of this murder mystery that this film presents. So I think her role and her performance in this film really connects so nicely to that particular overarching theme. And even though it's a supporting role, I think her appearance and the kind of sensitivity that she gives to the performance, which is undeniable, I think really help to make it so memorable. So this is the actor Lee Grant, and her performance in the Heat of the Night is really splendid. When we get to the supplement here, it is essentially just a one-on-one interview with her, the actor, and she talks about her professional life. She talks, of course, about her experience with this film, In the Heat of the Night, and her performance here. And she gives anecdotes which I think are very helpful in terms of the filmmaking craft and style and the like, which is, I think, to be expected, of course, with any sort of supplement that is similar to this. However, what this supplement does, or the reason why I've put this at number 1, the reason why this is this goes over the top for me in terms of excellence is because the supplement gives Ms. Grant the sort of opportunity to talk about her career. It's a very moving discussion that she has, and it's incredibly moving because we see, or at least I see, her strength of conviction when she is speaking in direct terms and in very moving terms. Her experiences with the so-called Red Scare and the House Un-American activities, and how that affected her career and her life in quite a detrimental way. And not only her, but she also mentions other actors who were affected by this particular moment in U.S. history that coincides very strikingly and directly with the Hollywood film industry during the mid-20th century. It's a very frightening period of history, and she, unfortunately, was a kind of victim of this particular aspect. Now, she is speaking now, I think the interview was shot maybe in 2019 or 2018, something like that. So it's a recently shot interview. And she speaks in blunt terms, but also in very honest terms, and in very bold terms about what that did to her, how it affected her career, how she tried to come back, as it were, and how this particular film is so important to her career in the context of all that. And the interview also gives her a kind of opportunity to show almost her side of the story. Now, I admit, I'm generally aware of this aspect of U.S. history and U.S. film history, but I never had a full appreciation of how this particular aspect of U.S. history affected someone like Lee Grant in the way that it did. I didn't have a full appreciation of that, my friends, until I saw this interview, and I found it to be raw, I found it to be very powerful, and I found her take to be it was so it sort of opened the lid for me in a way that I really appreciate. In other words, it gave this such a human dimension for me, and it should, because there were many people who were tragically affected by this particular period. And so to have Lee Grant talk in these direct terms, but in a way that is sort of on her terms, so to speak, and in a way that gives her the opportunity to explain or to give a certain insight or a certain viewpoints and opinions about details of this period, is why I think this supplement is so powerful. It is an incredibly powerful supplement. I admit, when I first put the disc in and I was going through the supplements for the first time and I was going through the menu and I saw this, I was looking forward to it, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't necessarily expecting the interview to have the power and the punch that it had on me. And I admit that when I was finished with the interview, I was just almost overcome with almost a sense of numbness. I really felt almost ashamed in how I thought I knew about this period, but when I hear of it in these human terms that Ms. Grant provides it, I was left feeling almost ashamed, not knowing as much as I needed to know about this period. And so I really want to thank the Criterion Collection for allowing Lee Grant this opportunity to share with us her experiences and to share with us some really dark times, but also share with us this experience and her professional and personal experience as it relates back to In the Heat of the Night, and why this film is as significant as it is, or as it should be. So this is why I find her interview to be so powerful and so potent. Therefore, it is very, very easy for me. It is my pleasure to say that my favorite supplement from 2019 Criterion release, the one that I think left the longest lasting impact on me as a person, has to be the Lee Grant interview, which is found on the Criterion release of In the Heat of the Night. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. So, as I say, I expect that your list of favorite supplements will probably differ from mine, and that's okay, my friends. If you want, you can please let me know in the comment section below what your favorite supplements were from this year. And as I say, I didn't get a chance to talk about supplements that weren't necessarily Criterion produced. There were so many that were great, so many commentary tracks that were really, really lovely and just fun to listen to, and I just didn't get a chance to mention them here, unfortunately, so I apologize for that. But I'm trying to look at this from the lens of Criterion produced supplements. And even through that lens, I think we can see, my friends, that the year 2019 was yet again another great year from the Criterion collection. I hope you agree, and if so, please feel free to leave your thoughts and comments below. As always, I would love to hear what it is you have to say. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. So until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.